It's Dave's first ride on the Fantasy Football Today Express. Here we go. All right, Dave. FFT, welcome. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. This is a really fast show. Is it over already?
No, we have about 7 more stops.
Oh,
All right,
okay.
so we're talking about
What's stop number 1, Adam?
Tight end tiers overview is. Ladies and gentlemen, our tight end tiers overview.
What you sound like the teacher from Charlie Brown.
Okay, sorry. We're at tight end tiers overview. We just did an hour and 5 minutes on tight end tiers. What was one of your big takeaways?
The biggest takeaway is if you really get sick looking at tight ends like Njoku, Freiermuth, Goddard, Hawkinson, you need to target one of the first 10 tight ends on draft day. And it doesn't mean that you have to reach for one of the first ones, but you should really focus on trying to get a tight end with one of your first 9 picks. It's really not that hard to do. And the difference between the guys at the very top of the tier and the ones that are at the bottom, we're talking like tier 4 guys like Brock Bowers and Jake Ferguson. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they're separated by no more than like 4 PPR points per game. That means that the tight ends that you'll take later on will hopefully return very good value. One of the first 10 tight ends is what you should look for on draft day.
I can't do that. Ladies and gentlemen, stop number 2 is Dave's first tier of tight ends.
Why do you sound weird?
Well, if I
I know you're trying to sound like a conductor on a train.
Yeah.
Why is the conductor from like the South?
If I could, I don't have enough room to do the voice properly. You got to put your mouth really into your shoulder. What's your first tier? Because Jamie had a 4-man tier. You don't.
Right. But we have the same 2 names at the top. It's Sam Laporta, Travis Kelce. The idea is that these guys will average around 14 to 15 PPR points per game. That would be a slight improvement for both of them based on what they did last year. A lot of people are nervous about Travis Kelce because of how last year went. He had a long stretch in 2023 where he did not help fantasy managers. We know that he played hurt throughout the year. We know that when the postseason came, Patrick Mahomes just hit him with targets, drive after drive after drive, and he was awesome. I don't think that's going to happen this year. We saw the Chiefs make a lot of additions to their wide receiver room. They've got some options for Mahomes now, but it doesn't mean that Kelce can't get back to 14 points per game, which is basically where he was last year anyway. So was Laporta. I think there's room for a little bit of improvement from Laporta. We know that he can make splash touchdowns on top of being a good volume tight end. These are the top 2 guys. I'm looking for them in early to mid round 3 in my PPR drafts.
All right, so then you have a 3-man tier, which is interesting. You put Kincaid in with Andrews and McBride, and drafters seem to be doing that too. I mean, it kind of depends on where you look, but there's not a lot of separation between Kincaid and the others, although I haven't seen Kincaid going ahead of the others much, but he's pretty much in that tier according to ADP. So that would be Andrews, McBride, and Kincaid.
And I think it's much more of a projection with Kincaid than it is with Andrews and McBride. With Andrews, we've seen it for years where he's been Lamar Jackson's number 1 target. Anytime you can get a tight end who can lead the team in targets, you go and get him. And that's what Andrews has been. We know that he's a red zone threat on top of that. I like the potential for him to get around 13.5 PPR points per game, which is right where he was last year before he got hurt. And that includes some dud games from Mark Andrews. McBride in full PPR ahead of Kincaid. Again, we've seen it from Trey McBride, not just last year, but the year before when he's had an opportunity to suck up targets in Arizona. When he's the number 1 tight end, he gets going. The worry I've got with McBride is that he'll actually see a drop in targets per game because of Marvin Harrison being there. The track record with Kyler Murray is that when he's got a number 1 guy, he's got blinders on. He's going to that number 1 guy. And I think Marvin Harrison could potentially get 9.5 targets per game immediately in Arizona. And that can shrink the number for Trey McBride. Plus, McBride wasn't a huge touchdown getter, even when he was the number 1 Huckleberry for Kyler Murray last year. And then Kincaid does have the potential to be the number 1 target getter in Buffalo. 200 targets vacated from Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis leaving. I think Kincaid is one of the few versatile and explosive options in that Buffalo passing game. And I think in his second year, he's got a chance to take a nice step forward. And so that's why he's in the same tier as Andrews and McBride. In full PPR, he's 3rd in this group. But in half and non-PPR, I will take Kincaid ahead of McBride because I think McBride is so volume driven. And I think Kincaid has a lot more explosiveness to his game.
How many rounds need to separate tier 1 from tier 2 before you say, okay, tier 2 is where the value's at?
I think if you can get any of the tier 2 tight ends in round 5, you're crushing it. If you can get Andrews in round 4, I think that's pretty good. If you can get Trey McBride in late round 4, I think you're doing okay there as well. But round 5 for Kincaid,
And
not a top 48 pick.
When would you start taking Kelce and Laporta? Or Laporta
round 3.
Round 3. All right, we're going to take a quick break, come back and finish up our tiers discussion here on Fantasy Football Today Express. Adam and Dave back here talking tiers. We've gotten through 2 tiers, which is 5 players. What is your third tier, Dave?
Third tier is Evan Ingram, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts. And these feel like tight ends that are safer and don't have the same type of upside that the first 5 tight ends have. And I know that sounds silly because George Kittle, man, he's been so amazing for fantasy managers, but we talked about it on the main show. His per game average has actually gone down a little bit each of the last 3 years. We know there's a target crunch there. This is one of the least passing teams in the league in San Francisco. And when Ayuk and Debo are healthy, that means like around 5 targets per game for George Kittle. So you really need him to score to come through. That's why I'm a little hesitant on Kittle. Now, things change in that offense. Maybe a receiver gets traded. I'd be shocked if that happens. Then obviously Kittle would step up and be a much higher pick, maybe even be in that second tier, like deep into that second tier, right behind Andrews, something like that. He could still do that. Evan Ingram really came on late last season, but even when Ridley and Kirk were both healthy in Jacksonville, he averaged around 11 points per game in full PPR. I think that's what the floor is for him this
0
year.
touchdowns.
Right, exactly. He can tack on a couple of touchdowns and still be a good tight end. He's like one of those guys, you don't want to have a dud at tight end. You'll settle for Ingram. I especially like it if you can get him in round 7. Pitts is the one that I'm most nervous about. We've been talking about his upside for 3 seasons now. And for 3 seasons, he hasn't even gotten you 10 points per game in any type of format. And so if he might be second on the Falcons in targets, it might not be by much because I think Bijan's going to be a focal point in that passing game. I think Drake London's going to be the number 1 target getter. And I don't know how explosive Kyle Pitts is anymore. So I need to see something from him, some positive reports in the preseason and training camp for me to really buy into Kyle Pitts bouncing back and being what we all thought once upon a time he would be, which is an elite fantasy tight end. Until that happens, I'm kind of out on Kyle Pitts.
You got time for one more tier. So what's next and why is this tier so important?
I think tier 4 is important because to me, I'm adjusting on the fly here. I think there's only 2 names. I think it's Brock Bowers. I think it's Jake Ferguson. Bowers is kind of like the tight ends in tier 2 where there's upside. And we haven't seen it, obviously. He's a rookie and he's in Las Vegas with the Raiders and probably will not be the number 1 target getter there, but he might be number 2. And he might also get some fun opportunities near the goal line like he got at Georgia. He's a versatile player as well. He reminds me a lot of Kincaid. He might even be a little bit better than Kincaid when we talk about versatility. Fingers crossed that the Raiders use him accordingly. Might take a little while for that to happen. Ferguson has been pretty reliable. If you're looking for 10 or 11 PPR points per game, there were 9 games last year where he had at least 7 targets in Dallas. He averaged over 12 PPR points per game in those outings. And Dallas really hasn't done anything to improve their offense as far as the skill position players go. So there's a real opportunity for Ferguson to get back to averaging close to, if not over, 7 targets per game for the Cowboys. And he could end up being maybe the best value of everybody we've talked about so far. And you can get these guys round 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that range. Let's just call it round 9, take the average of the 2. And I think that they have got a chance to be good values as well. These are the 2 tight ends that I find myself ending up with in my drafts. Bowers, and usually I'll draft another tight end with Bowers, or Ferguson, and I don't mind Ferguson as being my only tight end when I'm done with my draft.
Yeah, Ferguson, you might be able to get around round 9 or 10 or something like that. It's pretty good value. That's Dave Richard. I am Adam Aizer. This is Fantasy Football Today Express.